The village of USD Kiga sat at the edge of the world. There were no shopping malls, no traffic lights, no sounds of a city rushing through its own life. There was only the Yana River, frozen solid for 8 months of the year, and the endless taiga stretching in every direction like a dark, breathing wall. The nearest city with a hospital was 400 kilometers away. In winter, that distance might as well have been the moon. Alexei Voronov had lived in USD Kiga for all of his 81 years, and he had never once wished to live anywhere else. He knew every creak of his wooden floorboards, every shadow the pine trees cast across his yard at dusk, every sound the wind made when it came down from the north carrying temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in under 3 minutes. He knew this land the way a man only knows a place when he has buried people he loved in its soil. His wife, Natasha, had been buried there 11 years ago. His son, Dmitry, had left for Yakutsk at 19 and never truly come back, only visited, twice a year, with a wife Alexei barely knew and grandchildren who looked at the village like it was a museum exhibit of someone else's life. Alexei did not blame them. He simply stayed, because staying was the only thing that still made sense to him. That morning, the thermometer nailed to his porch read -71 degrees Celsius. He had seen worse. Not often, but he had seen it. At that temperature, the air itself seemed to crystallize. Breath turned to ice before it left the lips. Metal became brittle as old glass. The taiga went completely silent, no birds, no wind, nothing, as if the world had agreed to pause and wait for something to pass. Alexei had woken before 5, as he always did. He boiled water for tea on the old wood stove, fed his dog Bayan, a thick-furred Yakutian Laika who refused to sleep inside no matter the cold, and pulled on his layers with the slow, deliberate care of a man who understood that in this kind of weather, every detail mattered. Thermal underlayer. Wool. Padded trousers. His grandfather's fur coat, reindeer hide, so old it had its own smell, a smell Alexei had associated with safety his entire life. Felt boots. 2 pairs of gloves. He had planned to do nothing more dangerous than check the woodpile and make sure the drainage pipe along the north wall hadn't frozen over again. He was halfway across his yard when he heard it. At first he thought it was Bayan, some strange, distressed version of the dog's usual bark. But Bayan was standing rigid at the fence, ears flat, staring not at Alexei but at the tree line 40 meters away. And the sound was coming from there. From inside the forest. It was high-pitched. Broken. Desperate in a way that had no language but was somehow completely clear. Alexei stopped walking. The sound came again. Closer this time, or perhaps just louder, pushed forward by whatever was making it. And then, at the edge of the tree line, a shape appeared. Small. Dark against the white. Moving in an unsteady, lurching way that immediately told Alexei something was wrong. It was a bear cub. Alexei had encountered bears before, every person in USD Kiga had stories. But not like this. Not in the dead of winter, when bears were deep in hibernation. Not at -71. Not alone, and not making a sound like that, a sound that even Alexei, at 81 years old, could only describe as crying. The cub stopped at the edge of his yard. It was small enough that Alexei could have carried it, though he was smart enough to know that instinct and size had little to do with each other when it came to wild animals. It looked directly at him. Its fur was matted, one of its back legs dragging slightly. And in its dark eyes there was something that Alexei, who had spent a lifetime being careful about projecting human emotion onto animals, could not explain away. It was asking for something. From somewhere deeper in the forest, a sound broke the silence. Not the cub. Something else. The dull crack of snow compressed under heavy boots, and beneath that, the distant murmur of male voices. Bayan let out a single, low sound and pressed himself against the fence. Alexei understood then, with the certainty of a man who had lived long enough to read a situation before it fully revealed itself, what was happening. The cub hadn't wandered out of the forest by accident. It had run. The voices grew louder. 3 men emerged from the tree line, rifles slung over their shoulders, boots crunching through the frozen crust of snow. They were not from USD Kiga, Alexei could tell immediately. Their gear was expensive, urban, the kind sold in outdoor stores in Moscow to men who hunted for sport rather than survival. One of them was laughing about something. Another was already raising his hand to point at the cub still standing in Alexei's yard. The tallest one stepped forward and called out across the fence. "We tracked that animal for 2 hours, old man. Step aside." Alexei did not move. He looked at the cub, which had not run. It stood close to his legs now, close enough that he could hear its ragged breathing, see the small clouds of vapor rising from its muzzle in the brutal cold. The dragging leg. The exhausted eyes. Then he looked back at the 3 men. Somewhere deeper in the forest, barely audible but unmistakable to someone who knew the sounds of this land, came a low, agonized groan. A mother's sound. Heavy. Desperate. Trapped. Alexei straightened his back. "Not today," he said. The tall man laughed. It was the kind of laugh designed to humiliate, short and dismissive, the laugh of someone who had never been told no by anyone who looked like Alexei, old, alone, standing in the snow with a bear cub at his boots. "You have no authority here, grandfather. Move." Alexei reached slowly into the pocket of his reindeer coat and pulled out a radio. Old, military-issued, the kind that still worked at -70. He pressed the button and spoke 3 words into it, the name of the regional wildlife inspector, and the GPS coordinates of his property, which he knew by heart. The laughter stopped. One of the other men grabbed the tall one's arm and said something low and urgent. The tall one stared at Alexei for a long moment, jaw tight, calculating. Then he looked at the cub. Then back at the old man who had not moved a single centimeter. They left. Not quickly, pride wouldn't allow that, but they left. The cub pressed its small head against Alexei's leg. If this story is moving you, take a second and subscribe to the channel. The hardest part of this night is still ahead. Alexei did not go back inside. He followed the sound deeper into the tree line, the cub moving ahead of him now, leading, glancing back every few steps as if making sure the old man was still there. The cold was absolute. At -71, the taiga at night was not a place any sane person entered alone. Alexei knew this. He went anyway. He found her 20 meters in. The mother bear had been caught in an illegal snare, a heavy steel cable wrapped around her left hind leg, anchored to a pine trunk. She had torn the surrounding snow into chaos trying to free herself. She was enormous, and she was exhausted, and when she saw Alexei she made a sound that vibrated through his chest like something ancient and unnameable. He stood still. Let her read him. Then he moved forward, slowly, speaking in a low continuous murmur, not words exactly, just sound, the same way his father had taught him to approach wounded animals 60 years ago. It took 40 minutes with his hunting knife and frozen fingers to cut through the cable. When it snapped, the mother bear did not attack. She simply stood, gathered her cub, and disappeared into the dark. Alexei made it back to his house just before 6 in the morning. His fingers had lost sensation somewhere during the walk back and it took him 10 minutes by the stove to feel them again. He sat in his chair, the same wooden chair he had sat in for 40 years, and drank his tea and said nothing, because there was no one to say anything to. But he did not feel alone. The wildlife inspector arrived by midday, alerted by the radio call. He documented the illegal snare, photographed the cable, and filed a report that would eventually lead to the identification and fining of the 3 hunters, whose expensive gear had made them easy to trace. Poaching at those coordinates carried serious penalties under Russian federal law. The tall man, it turned out, worked for a government contractor in Moscow. The case made regional news. Alexei was interviewed by a journalist from Yakutsk who drove 4 hours through the cold to sit at his kitchen table. He told the story simply, without drama. She was a mother, he said. Her cub came to ask for help. What else was I supposed to do? The journalist had no answer for that. Spring came to USD Kiga 4 months later, slow and certain, the way it always did. The Yana River cracked and shifted. The pine trees exhaled. The village emerged from winter like something that had been holding its breath. Alexei was on his porch the morning it happened. He saw her first at the tree line, the mother, larger than he remembered, moving through the new light with the unhurried confidence of an animal that owned this land far more than any man ever could. And beside her, the cub. Bigger now. Healthy. The dragging leg completely healed. They stood at the edge of the yard for a long moment. Alexei raised his hand. Not a wave exactly. Just an acknowledgement. The kind exchanged between two creatures who had shared something that required no explanation. Then they turned and walked back into the forest. He never saw them again. But every morning after that, when he stepped onto his porch in the early quiet, he looked toward the tree line. Just for a moment. Just in case. Some things don't need a ending. They just need to have happened.